Nickelodeon in the early 2000s was a very big deal, because by that point, they were probably the biggest giant in all of kids' TV media. Disney Channel wasn't anywhere near as big as it was about to become. Cartoon Network, I think it's fair to say, had lost to Nickelodeon on popularity. But I was here for all of it. I watched Nickelodeon, and by that point, I was 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, so I was the primary demographic, and for the most part, I was binge watching Nickelodeon. Whatever they put on, because remember, this is the cable era. You can't just choose whatever you want to watch. Streaming doesn't exist yet. I mean, I had a VHS tape and I would VCR record a few things if I really liked it that much, but that was rare. You kind of had to watch what was on. Now, when it comes to the 2000s, this video is me breaking down everything as I understand it, looking back as an adult, a married man with children, on what my childhood actually was. I just go to IMDb, and I'm looking at the most popular show that Nickelodeon had in the 2000s, and from 2000 to 2010, I'm really going to break it into two halves. So this is part one, part two is coming, because the back half of the 2000s is very different from the first half. That said, I'm not going to go over things that I said when I was talking about the 1990s. The only thing I'm going to highlight, if you didn't watch those videos, I would love it if you do go back, but truly appreciate it. Whether you do or you don't, you're here now. And in the 90s, you do need to know that Nickelodeon said, coming out of 89, 90, 91, they figured out after they launched the show Are You Afraid of the Dark, which is right before the Snick era launches, the Snick TV block. The execs on, the ones who were interviewed for the documentary The Orange Years, they said themselves, they figured out that parents really didn't know what their kids were watching. And because of that, they just focused on making television that kids wanted to watch, regardless of whether or not it was something that their parents wanted them to watch. I'm not here to come up with this crazy conspiracy theory that Nickelodeon was out there to just, stick it to the kids. That's not the point. What I am saying is that they were following profits above all else. And some of the writers did know exactly what they were doing when they were adjusting, shifting, and crafting these shows. Remember, this is television. These shows don't just pop out of nowhere. They have writers who are adults who build every single component in. Because I am a man who is dedicated to the Christian faith, and for that matter was raised in a Christian home before getting more serious about it in my adulthood, I'm going to look at all of these shows through that lens. And remember, Nickelodeon was doing all of this, running their network with the attitude that parents really don't know what their kids are watching. So just think about what might show up in the show if that is how you're running your business. But hey, I guess it's up to the parents to figure it out. And if they're not in the room, well, let the chips fall where they fall. So let's talk about it. The 90s was wild, and it's what built Nickelodeon. But when you get to the 2000s, I'm going to call this, at least this first half of the 2000s, kind of break it up into 4 categories. I'm going to walk through the shows with some semblance of, timeline order, but I'm also going to break them up into categories just in the interest of time. And the first category I have to address is what I call the unicorn. There's only one. The unicorn that they had for the 2000s era is The Amanda Show, because it actually starts in 1999 and rolls into 2000, and for the time it was on, it was the most watched live action show that Nickelodeon actually had. Keep in mind, all that is still on the air. Amanda Bynes started on all that. She launches into, her own show. They make a sketch comedy around her. They have little, skits like, Moody's Point and Block Blister and The Girls' Room. I remember that, I remember them. I actually remember the show. I remember it well enough. And even, Drake Bell, Josh Peck, I think that's probably when people were truly, introduced to both of them. So without the Amanda Show and, kind of what it does for the 2000s, you probably don't get Drake and Josh later, which I ain't talking about in this video, but it's coming in the next one. Everything that kind of offshoots from it, because there would be no, iCarly if we never saw Miranda Cosgrove show up on Drake and Josh. This is a huge deal. But the Amanda Show is pretty wild. I mean, it keeps a lot of all that energy, but it's a sketch comedy show. It's just kind of over the top. It's not necessarily a show that had a whole bunch of crazy undertones. I mean, yes, there's some sexual innuendo, like a scene where, they're talking about, you gave me crabs. That was the punchline of a joke, things like that. But fundamentally, it's just over the top comedy. Nothing really, too crazy in terms of if you were actually to follow it, line for line. But you don't have any parental influence whatsoever. It's just, characters doing a bunch of wildness in the name of entertainment. And because there really wasn't anything like it in the live action column on Nickelodeon at that time, I mean, you could count all that, but this is a spin-off before we got to real sitcoms that were, consistently being pumped out. Because there's other things happening. And the real reason why The Amanda Show is a unicorn is not just because it was live action and successful. There were other live action shows. They just weren't that successful. I mean, I'm gonna throw some names out you probably don't even remember. The Brothers Garcia, 100 Deeds for Eddie McDowd. Like, that's a thing. These shows existed and you can go dig them up. But good luck out there trying to find evidence that they really happened, aside from what, bare minimum you can find on Google. The Amanda Show was a little interesting in the fact that it just abruptly stopped. It was very successful and then it stopped. Now, we've come to find out years later, there was a lot of controversy off the camera. And because of all those things, Quiet on Set gets into some of it, the show just kind of disappeared. But Amanda Bynes goes on to be a star, does some other movies, moves away from even Nickelodeon, and there you have it, The Amanda Show. But there's only one unicorn, so what else happened? Because after that, you have the show that I call The Forgotten. And most of this really relates to the dawn of Teen Nick. Because Nickelodeon was trying to figure out who they were and who they weren't in the early 2000s. So they were trying to figure out what can they do with the teen market, because they were like, hey, some of our demographic is aging. Now, going to show for show, you had shows like As Told by Ginger, which launched in 2000. You had My Life as a Teenage Robot, which is 2002. Then you had All Grown Up in 2003. I'm going to go through all of them real quick. But if you're new here, I want to say thank you for even making it this far into the video. I'm Ezra Garnett, and if you really want to know the truth about the hidden messages behind nostalgic TV, then you are in the right place. And if anything that I say actually connects with you, it is always greatly appreciated if you would please like and subscribe. But if I don't, just let me know in the comment section, because I try to read them all. But As Told by Ginger, by the time that one pops off, they're trying to move squarely into the teen market. You have a character who is, the daughter of a single mother who's divorced. We see her dad a little bit in the context of the plot. She has a brother who's a little off the beaten path. He even entered the weird kid competition or a weird human competition. Like, the only scene I remember was him outside in the snow, essentially naked aside from underwear, in a cartoon, rolling around in the snow because he had put lard on his body to keep him warm. Again, these are the type of things we saw in the plot. Ginger has friends. Her friends are on the, not popular side of, I guess, middle to high school. It's like middle high school age, I guess. So like it's teen, but it's still like on the younger side of teen. And most of the plots kind of revolve around like her kind of walk this line as far as like, am I going to be with the popular kids or can I kind of break in? Then there's the crew who she has. We see B plots around her brother and him kind of going off the beaten path with a whole bunch of, randomness. He has his friend, with the purple hood. I think they called him Hoodie. Like, I remember watching As Told by Ginger. I even remember the theme song by, I think it was Macy Gray. And the show even attempted to engage deeper themes, like things that would be somewhat related to teenagers, like addiction. They did that with an episode around caffeine, just to clarify, try to keep it somewhat appropriate for Nickelodeon. And As Told by Ginger even aired on Teen Nick, like when they tried to, do the Teen Nick block before we got the Teen Nick Network and eventually changed its name to the N. Like, all of that actually happened. But the show was still pretty tame, just being real. The same people did Rugrats actually did this one, but you don't have the talking baby stick. And when you lose that, it's really not all that special. So I think that's why it kind of only lasted 3 seasons, barely. Like, it limped into the 3rd season and then got shut down. And remember, Nickelodeon's trying to figure out their footing, because if you know what happened in the 90s, things were pretty wild. But here we are, As Told by Ginger. Because My Life as a Teenage Robot drops in 2002, and for the most part, most people don't even remember that it happened. It's about XJ9, who is, a humanoid or a sentient robot. So it's like a robot who has a soul. I guess she goes to high school, as far as I remember. And, she has friends and all of that. I even think there's like something around love interest or something like that. But again, going entirely off head. And she's created by this professor, but she's like somewhat a superhero, but also like a typical teenage girl in the general sense. So a lot of the jokes kind of go around that. Coming back to that show, thinking from the year 2025, it's actually a little wild, because now we have an AI generated world where, people even have, AI, companions and so on and so forth. So that's pretty wild when you think about where this show was, having conversations 20 years ago. But My Life as a Teenage Robot didn't do all that well either. It ran for like 2 seasons and basically just kind of flamed out. I think it was like not even barely 40 episodes before it was over. And to be real about it, it never felt like that show to me fit in with Nickelodeon, but they were really in their experimental phase in the early 2000s. So you had, some Cartoon Network folk who came over to work on different things. This is one of those moments, and obviously it failed because the guy who helped to do this went right on back to Cartoon Network shortly thereafter. I think he worked on like Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends for whoever actually watched it. I wasn't in that group, but I'm sure somebody did. Considering that As Told by Ginger was like a teen show that wasn't teen enough, I think that's kind of how people feel about why it didn't work as well. And My Life as a Teenage Robot was a teenage show that wasn't, teen enough in a whole different direction. It was a little too off the beaten path. Both of those failed, and then Nickelodeon took another crack at it in 2003 with All Grown Up. They took the Rugrats kids, grew them up to not even really teens, preteens, and tried to make a show around that. Now, because you have the nostalgia hit of characters who people were familiar with, I mean, I've already talked about Rugrats in another video. I mean, the characters are grown up, but they ain't all grown up. And the plots were pretty, I don't want to say basic, but they were just kind of like relevant plots that, a preteen kid might have, because they were like not really even teenagers. They were like more 12, 11, 13, like in that window, but I don't even know if anybody was really 13 except maybe Angelica or like Susie. And when you lose the talking babies bit, which it wasn't just about the talking babies, it was the fact that in Rugrats you had kids who were, somewhat making satire and, comedy around the world as they were trying to understand what it would like to be an adult, out of the mouth or out of the experience of a baby. Like, that's what the show was and why I think it lasted so long. So when they tried to come back to the drum and hit it again with All Grown Up, I mean, it ran for technically 5 seasons, but it never even made it to 60 episodes. You gotta remember, we're talking about a Nickelodeon that has SpongeBob SquarePants on the docket. A show that went for 16 seasons. 16 seasons. All the way through the 2000s, into the 2010s, and came out of the 90s. So when I say all of these shows were somewhat failures or, forgettable or like, yeah, they happened, but like nobody's really going back to them like that. That's what I mean. Depending on how you look at it, All Grown Up, because it did more episodes, was more successful. But it was really, as told by Ginger, redone again with characters who you were familiar with and actually watered down even more. Because Nickelodeon clearly, again, is still trying to experiment, like, where is our lane? And those two shows were both, again, not aggressive enough compared to things we saw in the Nickelodeon 90s. Because if you know The Angry Beavers, Cat Dog, and what those shows actually were, especially once you go back to the Ren and Stimpy era or the Rocko's Modern Life era, this is way watered down compared to what we were seeing at that time. But remember, they're throwing stuff at the wall to see what sticks. But before I get to the one show that is clearly the standout hit from this era, I gotta give you the next few that weren't exactly that, but you probably do remember for a whole bunch of different reasons. So in 1999, heading into 2000, doubling all the way back, Nickelodeon did give us Rocket Power. Now, I remember watching that basically when it dropped. Like, I remember the lead up, the commercials, all of that, and then watching episodes air from that point on. Probably saw almost every episode for the most part, because remember, it's the cable era. We ain't have that much choice. Rocket Power give you all of this, X Games vibes with all the extreme sports stuff, skateboarding and inline skating and, street hockey, all of it. You have the two characters, Reggie and Otto, who are brother and sister, or, Reggie is the sister. And then you have their father, Raymundo, that's what they used to call him. But he is a widower. So we've seen divorced parents in other shows, and now we have a widower. I mean, they have a friend named Sam. Sam is from Kansas, but he has the N on his shirt. That's a glitch in production, because the N was supposed to be for New York. Regardless, he is the child of divorced parents, and he stays with his mom. Then you have another friend named Twister, who he does have parents in the home, a father and a mother, but we don't really see them a whole lot in the plot work then. Like, it just is what it is. I mean, it really kind of rode on the extreme sports, kind of tip for most of this. I mean, the show was, again, still done by the exact same, production group who were behind Rugrats and then All Grown Up or even As Told by Ginger. So those folk went to work a whole lot in this era. And Rocket Power, I think it lasted pretty long. Like, it had, quite a few seasons that hit from 99 into like 2004-ish or 20, even probably getting closer to 2005. They even did a made-for-TV movie. And you can't forget the character named Tito, who used to run a surf shack alongside, the father of, Reggie and Otto. And he provided what they call like, the philosophical or like, spiritual leadership for the kids. He would give a whole bunch of one-liners about like how they should live and how they should move and address the problems in their lives. I mean, for the most part, Rocket Power was really depending on the extreme sports hit. If it was going to take that show over the edge. I mean, the jokes and things, like, again, yeah, there may be a little bit of innuendo, a little bit of, adult humor or something, but it's nothing too crazy compared to what we saw in the 90s. So it's pretty clear that Nickelodeon toned it down a little bit, probably in response to some of the criticisms. And then in 2002, Nickelodeon tried it with Jimmy Neutron Boy Genius. They actually launched it as a movie first and then did a spin-off show. Now, I remember watching the movie and watching the show. And you would have thought that because of the amount of money it takes to produce a movie, that the show would have been more successful. It only ran for about 3 seasons. So let that sink in. Jimmy Neutron, he's a boy genius, it's kind of baked into the title. He has his friends Carl and Sheen. There's a girl, Cindy, I guess he likes her or something like that. There's a girl, Libby. I mean, I vaguely remember these things from watching the show. But more or less, the plots kind of revolve around, Jimmy's inventions and something goes wrong with him, and then him and his friends get into, all these types of, crazy situations as they kind of deal with, the aftermath of whatever he created. The jokes and everything, it actually kind of felt like it was actually on brand, like kind of hit the age market they or age demographic they were actually trying to go for. It wasn't as much of the adult humor. Like, yes, there were some innuendo and some things like that. Like, a scene where, Jimmy was, in a bathtub. But I mean, it's a cartoon, so they don't over portray what's going on. But like, you see that, I think I remember Sheen was in a shower. I mean, stuff like that. But overall, the show kind of stayed in the pocket of the demographic they said they were going for. And maybe that's the problem, because the show didn't last all that long. Remember, in the 90s, Nickelodeon pushed the envelope a whole lot. The two most interesting things I noticed about that show was, one, the fact that Jimmy Neutron is a boy genius, but he's still going to school with regular kids. Don't really see how that works, because if he's a science genius, he probably should be in college or something like that. But hey, it is what it is. And the other half was how they dealt with the parents, because this is the first time, if you've been clocking, aside from All Grown Up, that I've mentioned in this video, where we actually have a character who has two parents. That's the first time I'm mentioning it. And his parents are, not my words, Common Sense Media said it, they called them typical spacey parents. Spacey, that's the word, kind of like, parents who have been dumbed down, not really offering any value, no real parenting. Like, that is how they clarify it. Doesn't mean that they don't have any scenes where the parents don't do something, but it's, again, severely watered down in the context of Jimmy Neutron. But perhaps the most aggressive show that Nickelodeon came out with in this window has to be Danny Phantom. It dropped in 2003, didn't last all that long. It's another one of those shows that kind of feels a little bit off-brand. You had some Cartoon Network energy involved with it. But hey, it is what it is. Because Danny Phantom is a boy who becomes part ghost. Similar to how Spider-Man became Spider-Man, but, this time it's a ghost. He has friends Tucker and Samantha. Samantha is like a gothic, girl. Like, that's how she's dressed and how she's portrayed. But she comes from a conservative home, conservatively Jewish actually, but, she's obviously living on a very different, different path. And even with Danny Phantom, who, he has some ghosts who are allies, who he works with. Then there are the evil ghosts who he's, going after. So you have ghosts who are kind of going both directions, apparently, including him. Like, the plot actually even builds in this component where his parents are, ghost hunters, not ghostbusters, but ghost hunters. And they want to, dispel or catch all the ghosts, which means that they, kind of sense that there's ghost energy in the home because of their son, but they're trying to figure it all out. So, hey, this was a representation. And if you're coming from a Christian context, you can already see the problems. The show is classified as comedy horror. If you go look it up, that's one of the classifications of the show. So they are trying to scare the kids to some degree. And I actually watched it because even though I wasn't supposed to, it was on Nickelodeon. I didn't have a whole lot of choices. And if parents weren't in the room, I just watched what I saw. So Danny Phantom, definitely represents Nickelodeon pushing the needle or pushing the envelope, especially when it comes to, portrayals, especially the whole concept of the parents disagreeing with this component of their son who is, something that's central to him. You can kind of interpret that how you want to, especially in the context of where our culture is today, like in America. But ultimately, the show didn't work all that well. I mean, it developed a cult following from those people who, kind of like this direction, but it probably was like a little bit too over the edge to kind of have mass appeal. But Nickelodeon tried it. Danny Phantom. That actually happened. Which brings me now to a show which you cannot say you watched Nickelodeon in the early 2000s if you don't remember it. The Fairly OddParents. Because in 2001, that thing dropped. It ran for 10 seasons. Ran for like 5 seasons, took a little break, and then came back. They had a live action movie. They did a crossover with Jimmy Neutron. Like, the Fairly OddParents was a big deal. And this is one of those moments where now I have to talk about why. Because the show was unique, and I think it hit on all of these, crazy points. It had enough of that 90s Nickelodeon energy, but does it in a brand new way. Figured out how to give you cute and cuddly feeling characters in order to move the needle to where we're at. Timmy Turner is the main character. I do remember that. I mean, what was that? Designer did the song with Timmy Turner, said it in the song. I'm sure it had some deeper, meaning. But hey, Timmy Turner has parents, but his parents really aren't doing any parenting. That's important. They build that into the show. Again, space cadet parents, they're kind of useless in the grand scheme of everything. These fairy godparents, that's what they are. And they essentially are like his real parents or actively, in his life. And they're granting him his wishes. And most of the time they grant him a wish. What ends up happening is it doesn't go exactly the way he had hoped. And the plot kind of, follows off that direction. I mean, yeah, he has friends and a whole bunch of other stuff that happens. But it primarily revolves over the whole show aims around Timmy Turner with these fairy godparents who are giving him these magical wishes, and we kind of watch how it all plays out. Now, if you're coming from a Christian seat, then you can kind of see what's wrong with this. Anytime you bring up, magic and the powers and, kind of where did that come from and so on. But yes, somebody can interpret this as, cute or, safe enough. That's fine. But something those parents should have been aware of is that in this show specifically, there is a lot of cross-dressing. It just is what it is. At least 10, 11, 12 occasions. I think it's like 12 to 13 occasions where you could argue that there were, clear moments of cross-dressing involving the main character, as well as, additional ones, just if you focus on the godparent specifically, Cosmo, who is the male godparent, Cosmo, his situation, he's another space cadet, so they represent the man as kind of, dim-witted compared to, Wanda, who is the, woman, godparent. They even had an episode where they did like a gender swap, like with Timmy's character, and, I think the godparents and some other stuff happened. They had an episode where the father was dressed up, in a dress as well. Like, they were pretty consistent on the cross-dressing narrative. And just to keep this in perspective, all the way back in the 90s, we had a Nickelodeon executive who went on record to say that he didn't want to have cross-dressing represented in shows, or specifically he was working on the Angry Beavers at the time, because he didn't want to confuse the kids. But he must not be the executive working on this show, because they definitely did it over and over and over again. It wasn't like a random thing that happened once in a plot. And notice, I'm not even talking about the non-binary character that they built into the reboot version of the show. I'm just focusing on the older version that you would have found in the early 2000s. But the Fairly OddParents was a big hit. So now you have SpongeBob on the boards, because they got that one out of the late 90s into the 2000s. And now you have the Fairly OddParents. Those are your two hits. Anything else that had success either washed itself out accidentally, like the Amanda Show, for controversies and things that were even, more off-camera than anything else, or the shows just weren't all that successful. And all the ones that weren't all that successful were the more tame shows. It just is what it is. Either that or they went too far in one direction with a show like Danny Phantom. And to this moment, you have barely any representation of two-parent homes throughout all of these shows that I've mentioned. You've got sketch comedy shows where you don't really need parents at all, at least not in any real context. Then you've got, single parents represented multiple times. All Grown Up is repeating characters, so you kind of have to keep the parents there. And the show is relatively tame, and yeah, it had some nostalgia hit to keep it going. But at the end of the day, nobody thinks about All Grown Up. We think about Rugrats. And you even have Nickelodeon experimenting with just how to hit the teenage market, because they were trying to, kind of play both sides and kind of, keep their audience with them a little bit longer. The ones who were watching in the 90s, kind of moving into the 2000s. At the end of the day, I'd call this the experimental era for Nickelodeon. Because they had the 90s where they built their way up, but they definitely had to go off the beaten path in order to figure it out. And they took some criticism in the media. Remember, not my words, check Common Sense Media and so on, there was criticism, but they did get some hits that emerged, and on the back half of it, they were figuring some things out in order to establish what was going to work going forward. Because once they got it down to a formula, and most of that formula they decided to move to live action, that is where they stayed. And that is the Nickelodeon that I remember the most. The back half of the 2000s. To clarify, I am not suggesting in any way that Nickelodeon is responsible for ruining an entire generation. But what I am saying is they certainly were experimenting on the journey to try to make a bunch of money with the millennial generation. And when you experiment with people's children, the results that you get might be a whole lot more than you ever expected. If you actually made it all the way to the end of this video, I do have to admit that thank you doesn't do it justice anymore, because you are a real one. And if anything that I said at all actually connected with you, it is always greatly appreciated if you would please like and subscribe.